This podcast series includes discussions about ketamine use and the potential harms associated with it. Our goal is to provide balanced, evidence-based information to help listeners better understand ketamine and its impact. If you or someone you know is affected by ketamine, please check the podcast feed for further advice and resources.
And because I got such a tolerance to it, no one would know. If anything, I'll come into work without it, all twitching and stuff, and they would think I was high then. Everyone knew my bladder was fucked, so going to the toilet wasn't really an excuse. It was just like, yeah, I need the toilet, go toilet, I might as well do a line while I'm here.
I was in a forest taking ketamine, drifting cars with some friends. I got run over by a car. I crushed my left leg, broke it. I walked around on it for 3 days before I went to the hospital, just taking ketamine, thinking it was all right.
With the ketamine, it always made me feel good, and I never woke up feeling shit or anything like that.
It gets out of hand quite quickly, and you find yourself in a stuck position.
Welcome to Frontline, where we are taking a balanced and informed look at ketamine use in this new 4-part podcast series.
In part 2, we'll be exploring the impact of ketamine in more detail, both on the brain and the body.
Ketamine can be taken in different ways, most commonly as a powder that is sniffed. This usually hits in about 5 to 10 minutes. However, when used medically, you would like to be injected with ketamine in its liquid form when it can hit in seconds. Once ketamine enters the bloodstream, it quickly crosses the blood-brain barrier, which is a protective filter that controls what gets into your brain. Ketamine is small and fat-soluble, so it moves through easily and starts affecting neural activity almost immediately. Ketamine acts as a dissociative anaesthetic, meaning it disconnects signals between the brain and the body. This leads to pain relief. It blocks pain signals, which is why it's used in emergency medicine. It also acts as a muscle relaxation, and at high doses, it can cause temporary paralysis. It can also affect the heart rate and blood pressure. For example, ketamine stimulates the sympathetic nervous system, increasing both. This is why it's sometimes risky for people with heart conditions. And it can also cause nausea and dizziness, common side effects as your body processes the substance. But the real action happens in the brain. Ketamine works differently from most drugs. It doesn't just boost or block dopamine like many substances. Instead, it targets the glutamate system, specifically a receptor called NMDA. Glutamate is the brain's most abundant neurotransmitter, responsible for learning, memory, and neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to adapt and rewire itself. When ketamine blocks NMDA receptors, the brain temporarily disconnects from sensory input, leading to dissociation or an out-of-body experience. New neural connections form more rapidly, which is why ketamine is being explored for depression treatment. It helps create new pathways, especially in areas linked to mood regulation. The default mode network, or DMN, the part of the brain responsible for self-reflection and identity, slows down. This can make people feel detached from themselves or reality. At high doses, this disassociation can escalate into the K-hole, where users experience a dreamlike, sometimes immobilized state. And don't forget, ketamine is an anaesthetic, and so people can harm themselves quite severely and not realise the damage until the effects wear off. The following interviews are from people currently in recovery at the Birchwood Kaleidoscope House.
It's very relaxing, and if you are dealing with traumas, or you've got a stressful life, or you just want a release from reality, that is, to me, very dangerous for you to go and take that drug, because for the period that you're on using ketamine, you have no conscience. You are just in a relaxed state of mind, and that's very much what I feel my deeper problem is with using that drug. It gets out of hand quite quickly, and you find yourself in a stuck position, and I think you only realise once you have made that change. And it's the way that the drug went for me is you'll get the normal feelings of the drug. I wouldn't feel normal without using. And when it gets to that point, you realise that you're too deep.
Another challenge in the current climate is buying a substance, believing it to be ketamine, and it actually containing a range of other substances as well. So not only are you feeling the impacts of the ketamine use, but you're also feeling the effects of other substances.
With the ketamine, it always made me feel good, and I never woke up feeling shit or anything like that. And at the start of it all, I could do like 2 grams in the night, and then that would last me. But before I came in this service, I was doing half ounce a day. That's how much it grew up to, because like a couple of years ago, I could get like an 3.5 grams for 90 quid. But I got back in with this kid that I knew 20 years ago, or 15 years ago when I was clubbing, who used to buy like 4 boxes at a time. A box is a kilo, so he'd have 4 kilos at his house. So then he'd sell me an ounce for £150. So where are you going to go? You're going to go 3.5 gram for 90, or you're going to get 28 gram for 150. But because I had a cardiac arrest before Christmas in December, and when my blood tests come back from it all, I had 7 or 11 different drugs in my body. I had benzodiazepam, I had fentanyl, diazepams, I had all sorts of opiates, all sorts of crap in my system. It did show up ketamine as well. When the pre-nurse come to see me, she did a urine test and she said, what have you been taking this week? I said, well, I've only had Nurofen, some paracetamol and ketamine. She went, well, you've got something called pregabalin in your system.
So I've been in care homes since I was 14, so I never had to hide it. Like, I was always high in my care homes, high anywhere when I was raving, not really giving a fuck about life or anything. And then when I was about 16, 17, I moved back into London and I got into college. I started working a job. I was talking to my family again. And it was like I couldn't just do drugs 24/7, like 24/7 every day. But then I started like putting Vaseline on my nose. I was doing it at work, in college, around my family. And because I got such a tolerance to it, no one would know. If anything, I'll come into work without it, all twitching and stuff, and they would think I was high then. The only way I would ever get caught, 'cause I would never get caught being out of my face, it was white streaks. They'll go all over my clothes, all over my hands, all around my face. Like it looked like Coke, but just everywhere. But as long as I put Vaseline around my nose, it would just hold it all in. And I was like, I'll be a chore. I'd have my phone out. I'm in work, like looking at my nose constantly, just putting Vaseline, making sure no one basically would catch me. And it was, yeah. And to be honest, it worked well, but it was not good. So it was that constant, I needed it, so no one knew I was on it, and to be normal 24/7. My bladder was already fucked, so it wasn't, everyone knew my bladder was fucked, so going to the toilet wasn't really an excuse. It was just like, yeah, I need the toilet, go toilet, I might as well do a line while I'm here. And it's just, yeah, it was more work than staying sober doing the drug. Like I was like working a full-time job trying to get it, sneak it, keep it away from everyone. And like you said, I was pretty successful at it. Like my mum and my ex-girlfriend, probably the only people who would ever know I was on it. And that was the scary bit about it. Like when you use your own drugs, people know and they can say something. But when you're around people 24/7 and they have no idea what you're doing to your body, what you're sniffing, how much you're taking, it is terrifying. Because it feels like you can't reach out to anyone, because then you're breaking this lie. And if you don't want to break the lie, then everyone's going to be thinking, oh, he's on it now. So you just continue lying and lying.
By the time I was 24, I was in a forest taking ketamine, drifting cars with some friends. I got run over by a car. I got hit by a car. So the driver was on ketamine. I was on ketamine. I crushed my left leg, broke it. I didn't go to physiotherapy. I walked around on it for 3 days before I went to the hospital, just taking ketamine, thinking it was all right. So I really sort of messed my leg up. And then from that, I also got nerve damage in my spine. So all of these things that have happened to me that have made my life worse and worse and worse, whether it's sort of like primary or secondary effect, ketamine's always been involved. And it's really scary because sort of it just happens overnight. You don't realize it's happening. You sort of just sit there watching yourself waste away. But in your head, you're having the time of your life. You don't care. It's not a worry. It's not a problem. It's not an issue. You can put that. We'll deal with that tomorrow. We'll deal with that tomorrow. We'll deal with that sort of mentality. And then tomorrow comes, and all you care about is picking up again.
We've already covered how ketamine affects the brain. What about the rest of the body? Ketamine is broken down in the liver, turning into a metabolite called norketamine, which is also psychoactive, but weaker. Most of it is excreted through urine within 24 hours, though traces can stay in hair and nails for longer. However, repeated use can lead to impacts on the urinary system. One of the most concerning long-term impacts of frequent ketamine use is ketamine bladder syndrome, sometimes called ketamine-induced cystitis. This is a serious condition that can cause severe pain, urinary urgency, and long-term damage to the bladder. Ketamine and its metabolites are excreted through urine, which means the bladder is exposed to high concentrations of the drug over time. This can cause inflammation and irritation of the bladder lining, leading to symptoms such as frequent urination. People may feel a need to go every few minutes, and it might not feel like your bladder has fully emptied. Pain while urinating, often described as a burning or cramping. Blood in urine, which is a sign of a significant irritation or damage. Or bladder shrinkage. In severe cases, the bladder capacity can permanently decrease, making it difficult to hold urine. Chronic ketamine use can also cause kidney damage. The constant inflammation of ketamine passing through the urinary system can lead to hydronephrosis, where the kidneys swell due to urine buildup, and even kidney failure in extreme cases.
This is Joe Moore, the registered manager at the Birchwood Kaleidoscope House.
So the typical signs that people will present with are weight loss, which includes a low BMI, so the body mass index. And we can't take people below 15.5 or 16 for the body mass index because there is a risk to life at that point. That's due to the sodium potassium levels within the body and the fluctuation leading to organ failure and cardiac arrest. So it's very dangerous to commence a detox when somebody's potassium and sodium levels or liver kidney functions are so deranged. The other things that we'll see is the incontinence issues. So we'll see bladder and bowel incontinence, and sometimes people will have both. People with blood in their urine, pain when urinating, and frequency in urination. They may be passing lots of clots and mucus from the bladder, which is extremely painful. And the bladder tissue actually is expelled as well because the bladder shrinks and it becomes inflamed. And at that point, sometimes the tissue is expelled, and that can be so painful for the service users to go through that process, and quite scary for them as well. We're frequently getting loads of urine samples where there's literally blood within the urine, chunks of tissue, and they've had to go through some extremely difficult times to pass that, and it's constant. And sometimes we have the screaming with the pain, because it's very difficult to get on top of that pain management, which is another complexity. Dealing with pain management and analgesia, looking at things like codeine, cocodamol, Oromorph. But then the side effect is also constipation. And sometimes people present to us with a prolapse. So that could be a rectal prolapse or uterine prolapse. So people are concerned about taking opioid medication for the pain relief because there's also that knock-on effect to having the constipation and if they've already got the prolapse in place. So we see lots of urine infections that sometimes they've been to GPs prior to admission and they've just diagnosed them with frequent urinary tract infections. But actually the GPs haven't asked the question about whether that person's using drink or drugs, and especially focusing on the ketamine element. There's a huge lack of awareness there. The other thing that we see is muscle wastage. So with the low body mass index, we'll see people with the lower limbs, their muscles have wasted away. They've got reduced mobility and nerve damage as well. So that can lead on to it being very difficult for them to actually access a toilet. Many of our service users have to squat on the floor to urinate because they're unable to weight bear, or they may go to the toilet on a bed with an incontinence sheet or a bedpan because that's more comfortable for them. If you imagine somebody's weight being so low and so dangerously impairing their body and their physical health, if they sit on a toilet seat for long periods of time to try to pass this mucus and the blood, they're in a lot of pain and discomfort at that point. So that's why they choose to use other areas to use the toilet. The other thing we see is toothache, increased oral infections, and that's obviously due to the ketamine going between the nose and the mouth, dependent on how they're taking it. Nasal obstruction, including partial and full collapse. So people will require ENT assessment, so ear, nose and throat referrals, and they won't touch that patient for 6 months because they need to ensure that person has stopped using ketamine at that point before they can intervene. We see abdominal and bladder cramps and the spasms that they get. They're concerned about their sexual function, erectile dysfunction, loss of libido. They don't know whether they're going to have fertility issues. Some of these people are coming through to us at 18 years old and they're concerned. What does their future look like? Will they be able to have children? Some people are having permanent changes to the body where they have to have an ileostomy or nephrostomy bag in place of their bladder and the bladder's removed, or they're having to have a suprapubic catheter put in place. And those psychological concerns relating to that permanent change of the body is something that person's going to have to live with for the rest of their life. And that also comes into play with being under urology for a long period of time, tissue viability to make sure you've got good skin integrity around the wound site, and also the psychological concerns and the support that that person's going to need moving forward.
This is James Mawhinney, the Senior Social Worker and Strategic Safeguarding Lead for Change Grow Live St Helens.
And what we've seen, because our young people have got a lot of fear around going to hospital, a lot of, like I said, difficulties with that waiting room, maybe some stigma as well, because they're using substances. What they started doing was accessing community services because they feel more comfortable in places like urgent treatment centres and GPs, etc. But not telling 100% the truth as to why they were there. So often getting diagnosed with things like water infections, etc., and being treated for that. And without that knowledge, not being offered signposting to drug and alcohol services, not having that specialist intervention.
This is Lisa Buckley, the National Lead Detox and Rehab Worker for Change Grow Live.
And the one thing that people are mentioning is anxiety, and particularly how people have struggled with their mental health. And I know we're all aware of this through the pandemic. And that seems to increase for people. And we know that there's a lot of research into how ketamine can support with mental health. And I think people are kind of going towards ketamine and look into that to kind of help with these anxious feelings that they're getting and finding something that is helping them. But, then that might relate to kind of wait times for mental health that have increased during the pandemic as well. And as we know, often with drug and alcohol use, people will self-medicate, and they found quite a useful drug that does that for them, really. And I think it's got missed. And it's caught a lot of services and organisations on the back foot, not realising in the background that very much for a lot of young people, this is developed into daily use. And I think the other thing is the cost, isn't it? And the fact that it's so cheap and that people are being encouraged to kind of buy more in terms of how many grams you can get for whatever the price is. And then, and the idea is that you kind of ration it out. That's not going to happen, is it? If you've got a massive load of ketamine in front of you, people are just going to kind of go through it, aren't they, really? And I don't think people have realised that the use of ketamine has changed.
This is Peter Furlong, the National Harm Reduction Lead for Change, Grow, Live.
I think from speaking to our young persons teams and what they're seeing, because we're not seeing a whole lot of young adults presenting with it. And when I say young adults, I'm talking about 18 to 30, because drug and alcohol treatment services isn't really for them. They don't really feel like we've got anything to offer them. So speaking to our younger persons teams who are dealing with under 18s, it seems to me that it's there's not much stigma around ketamine use. Like it's like it's because it's okay in the party scene and the club scene, then it's okay to use, normally, recreational, daily. So it's not like people talk about it openly about getting using ket. It's not like something to be hidden in any way. So I think that has increased its popularity.
This is Jack Randles, social worker on placement at the Birchwood.
It needs to be taken more seriously from a health perspective. And maybe it isn't. Maybe it's people don't outreach. People think, oh, well, you can just kind of tell them if they get the rest of their life together, stop doing these certain behaviours, they'll stop. They can avoid the ketamine. But really, people don't realise how much of it becomes your whole life. I think that's what I've heard from people anyway when they've been in here. Like I think people are going to social work not having a more special experience of seeing how intense it can be. From specifically a ketamine perspective, and I think it'd be good for them to see it a bit more. It'd be good for them to be educated more in my training. Like I know in my course, there's nothing about drugs and alcohol in it really.
We know lots of people use the drugs because of social anxiety, low mood, depression, self-esteem issues. There's a huge strain upon these young people around social media and what's expected of them. And things like body dysmorphia play into that as well. So we see people also having non-fatal overdoses. So they're at home, mainly spending long periods of time in their bed and away from their family and friends. And at that point, they are at risk because of the mix of what's happening with the ketamine, with the synthetic opioids, the nitazines and xylazines, and people also reporting fentanyl being present. And that poses that huge risk to somebody overdosing if they're not also aware around using naloxone as an opioid reversal drug. At that point, many services aren't giving those out to people, which is a huge concern. And also there's the people that aren't getting to us, the people that have sadly passed away who haven't had that support in the community, haven't had the GP awareness. They've attended A&E with their family members, and the GPs, the doctors in the hospitals haven't had any idea about ketamine. So they're turned away, and that's when it's too late.
I sort of started to experience some psychological effects at the beginning, but ignored them. And then by ignoring those psychological sort of effects, I then started to experience physical effects, which was like the K cramps, the belly cramps. I started to really have bad ones to the point where I'd be rolling around on the floor, sometimes in the middle of the street. Cars would have to stop. I'd be crossing the road, and then all of a sudden they'd start, and I'd just collapse to the floor. Sometimes I'd have to call ambulances. It got to a point where that was maybe 10 years ago. If I tried calling an ambulance now and told them that it was something with my abdomen, they'd probably take about 5 or 6 hours to get to me, because it's not a priority. It's not something that, I mean, there are people that are dying and do need them, and you feel like you're dying because it just feels like somebody's stabbing you repeatedly over and over for hours in the stomach. And then it sort of moves down, the longer you take it, it's a bit weird because at first that sort of like dip in between your pectoral muscles and then your stomach, it sort of starts there. But then, I mean, the last sort of cramps I had were last year, and they were right at the bottom where my bladder is. So it's almost as if it does just gravity wise goes ripping through your body down, 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 down until it just gets to your bladder, and then people end up weeing out parts of their bladder, all sorts of like jelly, blood. It gets to a point where it just has to come out one way or another, and if it doesn't come out, it blocks everything up, and then the urine starts going back up, and then you obviously get the problems with your kidneys and pancreas, and yeah. I did go to the my GP, and I wasn't honest with him to begin with. I just sort of told him that I was experiencing belly cramps, and he just prescribed me like Buscopan and things like that. And I think it was a omeprazole as well to help with your stomach lining, and then I sort of in my head I thought, all right, that's the trick. Take some of that. That will protect me, and then that means I can then take more of this.
So I must have been about like 15, 16. First time I went to the doctors, I was in massive pain, cramping, all sorts, and I didn't relate it to the drugs at all. I just thought there was something wrong with me. I needed to go on medication for my stomach lining. I was starting to form stomach ulcers, and they said it was through the drugs and not eating. I went on the medication, it started to get better, and then from then it was kind of just an up and down, how much I'm using when I stopped, of getting cramps, not having cramps, putting heat on my belly, basically just anything to get rid of it, like Gaviscon, Rennies, anything to numb my belly from the pains. And then as the cramps went on, you started like with the high, like I learned to control it. I was learning to control the pains, and I could do a bit more. But when it was bad, it was bad. I was rolled up in my house, couldn't move, screaming. Like I've never been in that much pain, breaking bones or anything. And then I must have got to a point where the cramps started to leave, and I thought I'd like cracked it. Like I found the solution to how I'm doing it. And out of nowhere, I started pissing blood, pissing jelly, couldn't go to the toilet either way. I was just constantly around the toilet, needing the toilet. The minute I went, I was in agony. And yeah, and as soon as the bladder came, it was like every 5, 10 minutes I was going to the toilet. And the only thing that would make it better was using more care. I could hold my piss longer when I was doing care. I could do this longer, that. And it just went from a fun thing I did to an activity to just, I need it. Otherwise, I can't go to work. I'll be in pain. I can't do this. I can't do that. And then it basically just took over my life.
So when I have been admitted to hospital through the use of ketamine, the doctor was basically asking, I was self-diagnosing myself to the doctor, and I was discharged after having a blood screening. Now, the pain caused from the use of Ket doesn't necessarily come through on a blood screening. So I was discharged after having my bloods taken.
At that time, I was sat in my mother's bedroom, disgustingly, just taking ketamine day in, day out with the bladder pain. And for the bladder pain, I was taking paracetamol and Nurofen. And then because the ketamine was anaesthetic, I'd take the ketamine for it. And then it'd just be a vicious cycle. The more ketamine I did, the worse my bladder was. The worse my bladder was, the more ketamine I did. I just went on that cycle for months. And I would urinate, and every 20 minutes I was getting up and I was stood at the toilet for 5 minutes trying to urinate, and it'd be like a couple of seconds of urine, and I get back in bed, and then it was just horrendous. Just a big horrendous cycle.
It is important to remember that not everyone who uses ketamine will experience this. These impacts are directly linked to long-term, regular use with high doses.
In the next episode, we will explore how we can reduce the harms of ketamine use, including those that use experimentally or socially, and those who are using it dependently. If you or anyone you know is affected by ketamine use and needs support, please check the podcast feed for further advice and resources.